Okay, so before I start graphing the data, this is what we're going to do. Here's Hooke's law. We have a force equals minus k delta x. What this means is that the force is proportional to the displacement of the spring. The k is the spring constant, and it's a measure of the stiffness of the spring. The minus sign is because the force is always in the opposite direction of the displacement. Okay, so if we're just looking at the magnitude, we can just write F equals kx, where x is the distance the spring is stretched or compressed. Okay, so what we're doing, we're hanging weights from the spring and measuring how far it stretches. So our force is the weight, mg, that's going to be ky for vertical displacement. But we're going to plot mass versus displacement. So if I divide both sides by g, I get mass equals k over g y. So if I plot mass on the vertical axis, y on the horizontal axis, the slope then will equal k over g. So by measuring the slope of the best fit line, we can get at the spring constant k. So when you do that, don't forget that since we have our mass in grams and our displacement in centimeters, we want to use CGS units, so G is going to be 980 centimeters per second squared. Okay. So we're going to do that twice. We're going to do that for the rubber band data and also for the spring data. Then finally, the third graph we're going to make, this is for the spring oscillations. In this case, the period equals 2 pi times the square root of m over k, where m is the mass that we're hanging from the spring. If I square both sides, I get t squared equals 4 pi squared times m over k, but I put the k underneath the 4 pi squared, and then I can see if I plot t squared on the vertical axis, mass on the horizontal axis, I'll get a straight line, and the slope will be equal to 4 pi squared over k, and then by measuring the slope of the best fit line, I can get at the spring constant k. So that's what we're going to do. Okay, so I have a spreadsheet opened up, an Excel spreadsheet. I'm going to enter the data. So the data, we always have to put the horizontal axis in the first column. So our horizontal axis is going to be the y data. So I'm going to put y here and then a little m for mass, and then we're going to do that for the spring as well. So we have two of those. So I'm going to have y and m, and then our third is going to be t squared, so I'll just put a t, that's, whoops, s q r a d, t squared, but I want that in the next column here, so let's see, next. Paste, and then this is going to be mass. I want mass in the first column because that's going to go on the horizontal axis. All right, now I'm just going to highlight a big block of cells and go up here and change from general to number. And we're going to go ahead and click in this little box here, and I'm going to change to 3 decimal places instead of 2. Okay. Now, it's probably not necessary to do that, but I'm doing that anyway. So for the y, for the rubber band, again, enter that first. We have the first position, we have 39.6. Enter, 43.4. 49.7. 56.3. 61.6. And 70.6, and then finally 73.8. Okay, and then for my masses, we went 50, 150, 250, 350, 450, 550, and 650. I'm missing one. And we did a 750. I'm missing a data point here. We have 39.6, 43.4, 49.7, 56.3, 61.6. Oh, yeah, I'm missing one in here, so I'll just move up, cut these, and move them down here. And this one should be 66.1 at 550. Okay. Alright, so my mass data is going to be the same for the other one, so I'm just going to copy those and paste those over here. Now I can add my Y data for the spring. We had 70.1, 76.6, 89.8, 99.5, 109.4, 119.3, 129, and 139. Okay, now for my oscillation data, on our masses we went 250, 350, 450, 650, and that's it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 250, 350, 450, whoops, I'm missing 550, and 650. Okay, and then we're going to plot t squared. So I have my t squared values, 1.239, enter, 1.656, 2.031, 2.430, and 2.876. Okay, now I've got all my data in, so we're going to make the first graph. So I highlight that data, click on Insert, and I go over to the chart, and I select XY scatter with no line. And now the first thing I want to do, I want to move it to a new page. So the chart location on the upper right, click that, and then I click the radio button for a new sheet. Now I have a new sheet. Now the first thing before I start doing anything manipulating here, I go to the page layout, and I choose on the orientation, I choose portrait. Now it's small, so I go to view, make it 100% so it's easier to see. And now I see my data, first data point isn't here until just before 40, so I've got all this empty space. So I'm going to start my graph at 30. So I double click here and I open up this window, and I start my axis at 30. Okay, so now my data fills the page a little better. I can close that. Okay, and right away I can see that I've got a kind of a weird curve to it. So let's go to a data point. So I put my cursor on a data point to where I get the little box that says series, and I right click, format data series, and I click on the paint bucket and choose marker, and then the marker options, and I'm going to increase the size to 10 point to make the markers easier to see. Oops, I didn't finish everything I wanted to do there. So I'm going to make the fill a different color. I'm going to make that dark blue, and then also on the border also make that dark blue, so it makes it easier to see. And now I can see my markers a little better. I got a strange curve. Okay. Now I could go ahead and put in all my my title and all that stuff. So let's go ahead and do that. So I click in the data area until I get the chart tools up here. Click on design, And then over here in the upper left, I have chart element. So I'm going to put in all the grid lines. The major grid lines are already there, so I'm going to add the minor grid lines. And I should do that twice to get both. Then I'm going to put in my chart title above the chart. And I type in, I'm going to have mass versus displacement for a rubber band. Enter. And then I'm going to add my axis titles. So my horizontal is going to be displacement in centimeters. And then I add my axis title for the vertical. And this is going to be mass. And that's going to be in grams. So I put a G in parentheses for the unit. Okay, so now I've got my axis titles. My axis titles, I want to make sure I have those in large enough font size. So I go to the home, and default is 10. I'm going to bump that up to 12. And I do the same thing for the bottom one. So I highlight the title, and I change the font size to 12 so it's easier to see. All right, now I'm going to put in my trend line, and see it's not linear. So I go to a data point, right click, add trend line. Now the default is linear, and I can see it's not linear. The points don't fit on the line very well. So I'll try, you have various choices, exponential, logarithmic, polynomial, power, so forth. So I'm going to just try polynomial. And the first one comes up as a order squared. Now that sort of fits the data, except it kind of misses when I get down here. Let's try a third order. Third order polynomial, well, that fits almost exactly. It goes through every data point. So we'll leave that third order polynomial. So that would mean it starts with an x cubed and an x squared term and an x term. So now I'm not going to get any information from the equation for the line, so I'm not going to put in the equation for the line. But I just wanted to show that this is non-linear. So the rubber band does not obey Hooke's law because we get a curve. We don't get a line. So, but I'm going to change the line. So I click on the paint bucket. So it gives me a dotted line, and I'm going to change that to a solid line. So now I've got a solid line. I'm going to change the color to match my points. I change it to dark blue. And so now I'm finished with my graph. I've got the title, I've got my axis titles in the right font size, I've got my data points easy to see, and I've got a curve that goes through all my data points. So that one is finished. Okay? So now I go back to sheet. So I click on the bottom here where it says sheet. I'm going to highlight my spring data. And then I go to insert, and the same thing, choose an XY scatter. And now the chart tools opens up. I'll go over to the upper right to where it says chart location. I'm going to move that to a new sheet just like before. And again, the first thing I want to do is change the page layout, the orientation, portrait, change the view to 100%, make it easier to see. And I go down here, the same thing. My data points don't start here until after 60. So I double click here, and I click on this symbol, choose axis options, and we're going to start it at 60 instead of at 0. So start at 60. And now I fill my data. My data fills the page better. Okay. And then I do the same. I make this one pretty. So I click in the chart area so that the chart tools opens up. Click on design. Over to chart elements in the upper left. I'm going to put in my grid lines. So the major one's already there. I'm going to highlight the minor horizontal. Again, grid lines. Minor vertical, so I've got all my grid lines. Now I'm going to add the title, so chart title above the chart. And this is going to be mass versus displacement for a spring. And I'll check the font size. It should be 14. That's what I want. Okay, then I go back to my chart tools and design, add chart element. Now I'm going to add my axis titles. Primary and horizontal is going to be displacement. And that's going to be in centimeters. So I put cm in parentheses. And I click on the home and I change it to 12 point. And then I go back to my design, in the chart tools, add chart element, axis titles, vertical axis title, and this is going to be mass. And this is in grams, so I put a little g in parentheses for the unit. And I go to the home and change that to 12 point. Okay, so now I go back to the design. I've got it on my grid lines. I got my title, axis titles in the right font size. I've got my graph title in the right font size. Now I'm going to work on the line. So again, I go to a data point until I move the cursor to any data point until I get the series box. Right click, format data series. Click on the paint bucket over here. Choose marker, my marker options. Now this time I'm going to change to, let's put in a diamond. And again, make this 10 point so they're easier to see. So change the size to 10. And then on the color, I'm going to make this one red. And same thing with the border, change it to the red. Okay, so now I've got my markers, and I can see it looks pretty linear, except the first point is off a little bit. Go to a data point, right click, add trend line, and this time I get a line, and it seems to fit everything except for the very first point. So we'll just leave that, because we expect it to be linear, and it fits very well with the upper points. So now I'm going to change this. I have blue dots. I don't want blue dots. So I go to the paint bucket and dash type. I change it to a solid line and I change it to red to match my data points. So now I've got my line in here. Okay, so one thing I forgot to do is I go to the format trend line again, open that up. I want to display the equation on the chart because we want the slope. So I display the equation on the chart. And I got my equation up here. And I'm going to click on my equation. And I'm going to click the paint bucket. And I'm going to put a box around it and a white fill. So I put solid fill. And I change the color to white. What that does is puts a white background on the equation so the grid lines don't show through. And I put a solid line border around it and make it black. And so I got a box with a black border around it for the equation for my line. I want to make it bigger, so I'm going to make that 12 point to make it easier to see. Now I can grab it and I can move it down here to the center of my graph. It's easier to see. Now, one other thing is the default, it always puts y and x. We're not plotting y and x. So this is just text. So I can go in here and I'm going to change the y to an m for mass. And instead of x, we have y there for our displacement. So I have mass versus y. And now I've got my slope in there. And so I'm going to round that to 3 significant digits. So I got 9.9491. I'm going to change that to 9.95. And I just type over it again. It's just text. The intercept value, we're not using that. So I'll just leave that number alone. Okay. So now we've got the graph is done. We've got our line. We've got our data points easy to see. We've got our axis labeled. And we've got the equational line, and we have our slope. Okay, so we just have one more graph to do. So we go back to sheet, So click on sheet on the bottom and I highlight that. Okay, now we're going to make the third graph, so for the spring oscillations. So I have the data highlighted, and then I go up to Insert, click Insert, and I click the chart, XY scatter with no line, just like before, and then I go up here to Move Chart, select New Sheet, and then again, go to Page Layout, select the orientation, change it to Portrait, and then I go up to View, change it to 100%, so it's easier to see. Okay, my first data point now is way up here, so it starts between 2 and 300, so I double click with numbers, and I'm going to start that at 200. And then the same thing here, I'm going to start at 1 instead of 0, so I double click on the axis, and instead of 0, I'm going to change that to 1. Alright, so now my data fills the page better. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and add all the other stuff. So I click on the chart, so I get my chart tools, click Design, up here in upper left, Chart Element. I'm going to add in my grid lines. So I have the minor grid lines for both X and Y. Okay, so I got all the grid lines, and I'm going to go to my axis title, or excuse me, I want the chart title above the chart, and then this is going to be period squared. Oops. SQARE, period squared versus mass for spring oscillations. So period squared versus mass for spring oscillations. Okay, so your chart title should always have a vertical axis versus a horizontal axis and the subject. Okay, and I check my font size. It's 14, which I want. All right, so now I go to Design again, Add Chart Element, Axis Title. I'm going to put in my horizontal one, and that is going to, of course, be the mass. And that unit is grams, so I put a little g in parentheses for the unit. And go to Home, change it to 12 point. And then go back to Design, Add Chart Element, Axis Title. I would add the vertical axis title. This is going to be period squared. And it's second squared, so I just put an S in parentheses and go ahead and hit enter. And I'm going to change that to 12 points. But my unit is really second squared, not seconds. So I go to the label itself, I click on the label, and I click right next to the second, so I have my cursor is there. I missed a little bit, it went beyond the parentheses, so I just used my arrow key and moved my little cursor right next to the S. And then I right-click in that box, and I select Font. And then I get this window, and then I check Superscript, and OK, and then I can type in a 2, and I've got a 2 superscript now. So now it says second squared. Okay, so I've got my axis titles, and they're the right size. I got my chart title. Now I'm going to work on the data points. So I go to a data point, I get this box, I right-click, and I format data series, choose the paint bucket, choose marker options, increase that to 10. Now I've already used this marker before in the other graph, so I'm going to change, well, let's choose a triangle this time. And let's change the color. So we've already used blue and red, let's try green. So I'll click on green. And then the same thing on the border, click the green. So now I've got green markers, okay? And you can see it is very linear. So I go to a data point again, right click, add trend line. And the line fits in very well, but we've got blue dots. So I click on the paint bucket, and I go to dash type, and I choose solid line. And I change the color to green to match everything else. So now I've got my line in there, and I forgot, now I've got to click on this symbol up here, and I check display equation on the chart. So now I've got the equation of the line on there. I should have that. And yes, there it is up there. There's the equation of the line. So I click on that, and then I go to the paint bucket. And again, we're going to make a solid fill with white. So we choose white, so put the white background. And I want a solid line border that's black. And I go up here and I make the font size 12 so it's easier to see. Then I can click here and drag it down toward the center of my chart. Now again, I have to change my equation because it's got y and x, and those aren't not my variables. I'm going to have t squared and m for mass. So I click in here, and instead of y, I'm going to put in a capital T. And again, just like I did over in the axis label, I right-click and I select font, and I check superscript, and then OK, then I can put in a 2. So now I've got my t squared, and then over here, instead of x, I'm going to change that to a little m for the mass. So now I've got t squared equals 0.004 m, and then I've got an intercept. I don't worry about the intercept. And so I've got my slope. I've got the equation of the line, it's the right font size, so everything's done on this graph. So this graph is done. Okay? So now all our graphs are done. The only thing left to do then is do the calculations to find the k values from the slopes for the spring oscillations and also for the Hooke's law for the spring, and then compare those. Okay? So that's it for this